I'm the only one in the office. Later that day, another agent comes in and says, "Hey, I need some help. Can you go with me?" And we drove 2.5, 3 hours to a little town on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation on the border of North Dakota, and worked a case where an individual had been shot in the head by another person. I remember, first of all, hearing the Indian names, which were unusual to me at the time. One of the victims, the victim's last name was Brownotter. And again, we were in this small community, and I remember again, being brand new to the FBI, new to law enforcement, walking into this small house, and immediately being asked to essentially process the scene.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Ernie Weyand. I am a retired FBI agent.
And can you give me a little bit of background in terms of growing up and potentially what led you to law enforcement?
Yeah. So I grew up in the East Coast in Western New York, a little town called Hornell, New York, that's located kind of near Rochester, New York. Growing up, didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. My father owned a plumbing and heating business, and I spent an awful lot of time working with my father over the years. As I started looking at colleges and places to continue my life outside of Hornell, I was involved in athletics and had been recruited to play sports at several schools, but one was the United States Military Academy, West Point, and decided to go to West Point. So ended up going to school at West Point, and from there went in the military. I was an infantry officer for a number of years. Left the military, went into private business where I was a business owner for a number of years, sold the business, but was always looking for things like the military, a job with a purpose, with a mission that was meaningful to me. I'd considered law enforcement, considered the FBI specifically for a number of years. And at the time that I was in my private business, the FBI was recruiting pretty actively. So I had put my name out there and ultimately ended up as an FBI agent, where I spent the next 22 years.
And Ernie, how old were you when you applied to be an FBI agent?
So I was in my 30s, my early 30s, which is kind of typical with the FBI. It was at the time and kind of still is. I think the average age of individuals coming into my FBI class at Quantico when I entered the FBI was about 31, 32 years old. I don't think that's changed a lot. It's gotten a little bit younger because of the focus, I think, on cyber recruiting and going a little bit younger there. But for the most part, the FBI, folks entering the FBI still tend to be a little older, primarily because of work requirements that are required before people come in the FBI.
And how about the requirements for your academy class? I always heard, or I always understood, that FBI liked a lot of attorneys with law degrees and accounting. I take it you had neither of those.
I had neither. So it's still, at the time that I came in, it still was a favored program to come in as an attorney or as an accountant. I think there was also different programs for linguists and for folks that maybe were pilots. At the time that I came in, there was the Southwest Border Initiative that was going on that you would be familiar with. And there was very active recruiting of law enforcement and military types at the time by the FBI. And this went on. The FBI was in a pretty active hiring period during this time from about 95 to 98 or 99, where they were really going out and aggressively hiring because of really the needs of the FBI, growth that was going on, retirements. So there was a good number of military that were hired during that time.
Okay. And so what year do you get hired, and when do you go to the academy?
So I was hired, and my offer of employment came, in I think early '96, and I went to the FBI Academy in June of 1996.
And how was the FBI Academy?
It was good, as a former military person who was used to structure, used to taking orders, following command, or doing physical testing. Being in an academy environment, it wasn't very difficult for me. But it was for lots of others because maybe they didn't have that experience. And so anyways, I found it to be really a great experience. The academy instructors I thought were outstanding. And, really being introduced to the world of law enforcement and was really kind of fascinating. The legal background of the work we do. Certainly the focus on ethics and integrity and just the way to do the job and do the job right.
So FBI covers so many different laws and crimes and everything else. Was there a focus at the academy that you guys covered, or they just kind of shotgunned everything at you?
Yeah, so at that time there was not so much a focus. I mean, if there was a focus, I think a lot of the case scenarios had to do with what at that time was traditional FBI crime. It might be a violent crime like a kidnapping or a bank robbery, or it might be a white collar crime or complex investigation of that type. There wasn't a whole lot in terms of terrorism at the time that was taught. There was a little bit in the world of foreign counterintelligence that was taught specifically, but it was more kind of a broad introduction to the concepts of investigative techniques, interviewing skills, tactical proficiency in terms of law enforcement tactics, use of your firearm, things like that.
Prior to getting out of the academy, did you have it in your mind that you wanted to focus on anything in particular, or you were just happy to get out and just start working?
I was excited to get out and go to work. One interesting thing with me in particular is at the academy, we have a choice at that time. And still, I think the selection process is where they give the agents a little bit of a choice in terms of what their first assignment might be. So you're allowed to choose different regions of the country you can go to. Of course, my wife is from the West. I chose a number of offices on the West Coast, San Francisco, Los Angeles, both of which had great needs for special agents at the time. So I thought I'd be going to either one of those places. Instead, I was assigned to Minneapolis, which was a surprise, which, ultimately, my wife thought that Minneapolis would be a great place to live. And about 6 or 7 weeks before I was to go to Minneapolis, I was out on the firearms range, and a person called me and asked me to come over. And there was an agent from the field who had come, was visiting Quantico. He had long hair, a ponytail. He had done good number of years of undercover work. And he welcomed me to South Dakota. And I told him I was going to Minneapolis, and he said, "No, you're coming to Pure, South Dakota." And I said, "No, my orders clearly state Minneapolis." And ultimately, I ended up in Pure, South Dakota. So it was a bit of a surprise at the last minute. But I went to Pure, South Dakota, which has started me in a career working with tribal communities, working what the FBI and what is referred to as Indian country work, because that's the statutory name or definition for the work that we do, working in tribal communities.
So before we start getting into your career, just a quick question for you. It's always been my understanding, so this is why I'm a little surprised you end up in South Dakota, that FBI likes to have new agents start in large offices. Was that the case? And how do you think, if that was the case, how do you think you ended up in South Dakota?
Yeah. So I know this because later on in my life, I was in a position to determine how we were assigning people to Indian country. But in my case, I was a little bit older. I had come out. I was an Army officer for almost 7 years, and then I had run a business. I'm a little bit older. I'm 32, 33 at the time. And I'd worked kind of independently for a good number of years. And they were really looking for folks that could work independently, be away from a large office and the structure of a large office. In my case, when I was in Pure, South Dakota, I worked for a number of years with my closest supervisor being, 100, 150 miles away, and oftentimes working alone.
Okay.
So that's in part of why they selected me and to do the work that I did.
Okay. So you get out of the academy, you're assigned to Pure, South Dakota. What do you start working on?
So again, very, very interesting. I show up to Pure, South Dakota. I was in town for a day or two, had met my supervisor. The next day, the office cleared out. All the agents had gone off to grand jury in Sioux Falls, which is 200 plus miles away from Pure. I'm the only one in the office. Later that day, another agent comes in and says, "Hey, I need some help. Can you go with me?" And we drove 2.5, 3 hours to a little town on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation on the border of North Dakota, and worked a case where an individual had been shot in the head by another person. I remember, first of all, hearing the Indian names, which were unusual to me at the time. One of the victims, the victim's last name was Brown Otter. And again, we were in this small community, and I remember again, being brand new to the FBI, new to law enforcement, walking into this small house, and immediately being asked to essentially process the scene. So it was a very quick introduction into, now we're doing it for real. I've got a lot to learn. And that it's going to be very different than, maybe what I've seen on TV or what my understanding was of the FBI.
So how does that work? I mean, I take it that was a homicide case that you're working on.
It fortunately was not a homicide case.
Okay.
But it was a person that, certainly was badly injured and was hospitalized for a very long time and so on. But so.
Okay, can you give the audience a little idea of, I want to say hierarchy, but how do things work on a reservation? Obviously, FBI is one of the main law enforcement agencies that handle stuff, but how does it work? When do you guys get called in? What's a typical, is it tribal police first and then BIA? Can you just kind of explain that?
Yeah. So typically the way that it works, and there should be, we could have a very long discussion about where the FBI works and has jurisdiction in tribal communities or in Indian country, because it's not everywhere. There's select states usually and places where you have, fairly large reservations, primarily in the West or southern United States, although Oklahoma and other places have FBI agents and federal jurisdiction. But anyways, the way that it works in tribal communities typically is that the tribe will have its own law enforcement. When I say they have their own law enforcement, it's up to the tribe to determine the type of law enforcement locally that they have. They can elect to have tribal law enforcement, in which essentially they'll receive funding, in most cases, from the federal government through a program, and then they set up their law enforcement. There's certain requirements that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Office of Justice Services will ensure that the tribal police department is doing in order to be in compliance and to ensure that they're doing a good job. The tribe can elect instead to have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Office of Justice Services place law enforcement there. So when you hear people talk about BIA law enforcement, that would be Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement that is serving, supporting, providing law enforcement services to that tribal community. If you hear about tribal law enforcement, typically it's that tribe that has created its own law enforcement. But they are, in almost all cases, going to be the first responder. When something happens, they have a regular police department, they have a dispatch, they have patrol officers, they have detectives or criminal investigators that will respond when something happens.
And we're talking even tribal police?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Two questions.
Yep.
What's the breakdown? How often does a reservation or a tribe choose a tribal police versus BIA? So that's my first question.
Mm-hmm.
And then my second question is, if you have tribal police, what type of training are they having? I mean, most police departments have to go to post or have some sort of official professional training. I'm always curious because I don't know what kind of training do they have.
Mm-hmm. So to answer your first question, the majority of law enforcement, kind of local tribal law enforcement agencies out there are tribal law enforcement. They're not BIA.
Okay.
The BIA programs are actually quite small when you look at the number of federally recognized tribes in the United States. I think there's 500 and I'll get the number wrong, but let's just say around 550 federally recognized tribes. In terms of very small percentage of those tribes have BIA law enforcement supporting them. Instead, they're tribal law enforcement. In terms of the training that both BIA and tribal law enforcement get, and again, I'll speak generally because it doesn't work in all cases like this, but BIA law enforcement, they go off to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. It used to be in Glencoe, where DEA does a lot of training. Now, primarily, it's in Artesia, New Mexico, and they go to the Indian Police Academy. And it's a regular police academy where they do all the normal things that you would see in a state post, firearms training, legal training, investigative skills, interviewing techniques, everything else that you would think. It's a very comprehensive program and high standards and requirements for BIA officers. In most cases, for tribal law enforcement, they go to the Indian Police Academy as well. There may be some arrangements in states where they've agreed and they go to their post training. But in order to receive federal funding, these tribes must have training like post-certification or certification through the Indian Police Academy to put law enforcement officers in patrol cars or to be working as investigators. I will say when I started back in the 90s, there were huge waits and delays on putting people in police academies that were working, tribal police or BIA police that were working. So oftentimes you might have somebody you were working with that maybe hadn't had that training yet. That's changed since the 90s when I started.
Okay. So Ernie, you're in South Dakota. We talked about the very first case. What is a typical case for you? Are you now? You're an FBI agent. Are you now exclusively working on Indian stuff?
So yes, at least working in the Pure South Dakota office. So the Pure South Dakota office was extremely busy with its Indian country work because of first of all, the number of agents that we had and the numbers of communities we served. So out of Pure, we worked the Rosebud Sioux tribe. We worked on the Lower Brule Reservation, Crow Creek Indian Reservation, the southern part or the South Dakota part of Standing Rock, and the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. We'd also oftentimes work the eastern part of Pine Ridge, and I also worked a number of cases on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in the western part of the state. So when you add that up in terms of population, I don't know where it was, maybe it was 100,000, 150,000 people that essentially we served or worked, cases, related to crime happening in these communities. I think it's important to note because you've asked about, tribes and FBI. The FBI's jurisdiction really extends to what are the major crimes. And again, the major crimes are articulated in federal statute, but they're really your most egregious felonies. They're murders, they're sexual assaults, they're serious violent crime, they're sexual abuse of children, and so on. Those are the type of crimes that we were working. We typically had our priorities of crimes that we worked, and our main priorities always focused on homicide, serious violent crime, aggravated sexual abuse of children, sexual assaults involving adults, and so on. That was typically kind of the progression in terms of priority.
Was there a certain threshold where they would, okay, this is an FBI case? Because I guess the question is, I'm assuming there's a whole bunch of stuff that they didn't call you in on. So what was the threshold to call you guys in?
Yeah. So again, I think a lot of it had to do with, first of all, our tribal counterparts having an understanding of is this particular case egregious enough that the FBI, we should be calling the FBI in. If it's maybe a typical domestic violence, and again, in terms of defining typical, let's just say that the husband slapped his wife. They wouldn't call the FBI for that. If that particular incident escalated and there was serious injury to the wife or to the husband, we would be called in. If there was serious bodily injury, if there was ever kind of a doubt, we would typically get the call. Or at least that's what we wanted to happen, because it was always better that we could get involved very early, instead of trying to make up ground later on.
So I'm curious about this, because if I'm sitting in Seattle and I've got a domestic violence case, then the local police will just handle it. On the reservations, they have their own either BIA or tribal police. So why aren't they handling those type of crimes as opposed to calling in the FBI on something that I just take domestic violence for example.
Right. So again, there's kind of a complicated or very kind of complex kind of answer that goes with this. But to really kind of boil it down, there's almost two legal systems that exist. We have to understand first that the tribes we're working with, are really separate sovereign nations. These separate sovereign nations, again, have their own law enforcement. They have their own prosecutors. They have their own jails. They have their own judges. They have jurisdiction, but just for misdemeanor type offenses. What would not be a misdemeanor? What would be a felony? A crime that occurs that would result in a sentence that's over a year or restitution over a certain amount. Those felony cases, they fall to federal jurisdiction in the areas where I work. So that's why, in part, why the FBI is called. That now the FBI is that group that works with the tribe to develop the case, to ultimately present it in the federal prosecution realm, to federal court, to U.S. district courts that are supporting the reservations. So, I will say that, as you've worked and as you develop relationships and partnerships, and as the federal government and tribal governments work together, that the two systems can complement each other. But oftentimes they don't. And there's lots of reasons because of that. It could be personality reasons. It could be historical kind of animosities that have built up between the tribes and the federal government. Could be distrust by the tribes to the federal government. Could be a number of things. So there's a number of things that are hurdles and potential hurdles between these two systems, creating, fairly significant inefficiencies between the two.
Okay. Question: can a non-Native American be a member of the tribal police? So, yes. Certainly with tribal police, they can be. In terms of BIA Office of Justice Services, technically a non-tribal member, somebody who's non-Indian, can be, although they have an Indian hiring preference that has made it very difficult for a non-Indian to work for Bureau of Indian Affairs, Office of Justice Services. It is very rare in my 19 years working in tribal communities that I've seen a non-Indian working with the BIA, Office of Justice Services. That's not the case with tribal police. They have a little more flexibility, or a lot more flexibility in that area. And I have seen a number of non-tribal members that have served, in a law enforcement capacity with tribes. Okay. Any interesting cases that you can remember in particular with South Dakota that kind of stand out because this is your first post?
Yeah. Oh, well, there's lots, right? First thing I'll say is, from an FBI perspective, in terms of a training grounds for agents coming in my opinion, there's no better kind of training ground than working in tribal communities, working Indian country, because as a young agent, first of all, I'm required to do a number of things. I'm working alone lots of times. I'm really required to go out and really forge meaningful relationships and partnerships with my local counterparts, whether they're tribal or maybe county sheriffs that are working on or around the reservation, or other law enforcement agencies. When I go to a crime scene, typically I am not only the crime scene manager, but I'm also the evidence collector. I am setting up that crime scene. I'm ensuring that it's properly preserved and safeguarded. I'm overseeing the collection of evidence. I've got to get really good at interviewing not only victims, child victims, but subjects. I have to be able to go out and interact effectively with the community. I have to be able to put together cases that will, pass muster in federal court. I have to be able to manage a very large caseload. I have to be able to communicate with prosecutors. And the one thing that we had is we were always in court because, again, we're like local law enforcement in the sense that, very different than maybe a typical FBI agent, where if I'm a white-collar person, maybe I indict a case every year or maybe every 2 or 3 years. Maybe I go to court 2 times during my career. It wasn't uncommon for me to be in federal court maybe 3 times during a week and in trial twice in 1 month on various cases. So anyways, that gives you a little kind of background in terms of the type of experiences that folks working in tribal communities in Indian country with the FBI have. In terms of cases that stand out, I told you a little bit about that first one I showed up on. I've talked about how we did a large number of child sexual abuse cases, which really, again, as a young FBI agent, I didn't grow up around that, where there's sexual abuse taking place. Certainly wasn't in my vision anywhere. Had never really given it much thought until I had gone to work with the FBI. And certainly I have young children at that time, and now I'm working quite regularly child sexual abuse cases. And one that stands out is one of the very first that I went to trial on. And it was on a gentleman named Winnepal Magpie. He was an older Native American. It was on the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe Indian Reservation. He was accused of, he was an older man who had married a younger tribal member. He was in his 50s, maybe even 60s at that time. His wife was in her early 20s. He had another family before that. Those kids were grown and had disclosed over years that their father had sexually abused them. Now he had younger children with his second family who disclosed sexual abuse. Again, it was a case where, I worked with a few of my tribal counterparts, lots of interviews, and ultimately Winnepal Magpie was charged with aggravated sexual abuse of several of his grandchildren. What stands out in this is, one, because it's my first trial, sexual abuse trial, as an FBI agent, and preparing for that. And at that time in South Dakota, in the 90s, there was still a number of, still very contentious from all the history that had gone on between federal government and tribes, the AIM kind of issues that went on in the 70s, extending up into the late 70s. Many of the attorneys that we faced were attorneys that had represented AIM members in the 70s. Many of the names were the same in terms of family members.
And Ernie, just before you go on, for the audience, what is AIM?
Okay, so AIM is the American Indian Movement, which there is, again, very interesting history of this movement and what happened in the 70s in Washington, D.C., at Wounded Knee, in terms of the death of 2 FBI agents on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in 1975. Anyways, there's still extensive history and still very raw feelings in the 90s about all this. So anyways, Winnepal Magpie was represented by one of the attorneys who had been very active during the AIM days. And anyways, it's a very contentious trial. And but the thing that stood out more than this is my first trial, very nervous, testifying, this is my case on display, was the resiliency of the child victims in this case that we brought up to testify, in just the job that they did. These 6-year-old victims of sexual assault that got up and talked about their abuse, that faced their accuser, the strength and resilience you saw in those child victims in that case. And it was, at the end of the day, Winnepal Magpie was convicted, sentenced to a very long prison term. And, and it, again, it stands out because because once again, it was that first case into sexual assault. I think, there's a number of other cases that stand out, maybe because they didn't have that outcome. One of the cases I still think about very often is one of the very first homicides I worked, which was the murder of a 12-year-old girl, Rashinda Rubidoux, on the Rosebud Indian Reservation. She had gone missing in September of 1997. Was reported late in September of 97. Her body was discovered just north of the town of Mission on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in October of 97. And I was one of the first people on scene when her body was discovered after being out there. She had no clothing, had been, put in this copse of trees that was north of the town. And ultimately that led to an investigation that took me and several of my colleagues in many places outside of South Dakota, really trying to ultimately determine who killed Rashinda Rubidoux. We identified a subject very early on, Jimmy Eaglefeather, an uncle, and ultimately focused on him during that investigation. He was ultimately convicted of some other crimes, sexual abuse, sexual assaults of young girls, and received a long prison sentence. But this case still remains unresolved. And, I think cases like that are maybe the ones that stick with me more from South Dakota, the ones that were kind of unresolved.
So, Ernie, I'm curious. There's a lot of, and again, you correct me if I'm wrong, but we talked a little bit about your career beforehand. There seems to be a lot of crimes against children that you worked with, or worked on. And so, starting off in your 30s, when you're starting to deal with this, is it? I guess what's the best way to put this? Is it alarming to you? Does it become easier the longer you're working on this, or is it always like horrific? I can't believe people do this to each other, and especially do this to children.
Yeah, I think that first of all, that's a great question because again, as I matured in the FBI and came in positions where I was determining who would work in Indian country and do these types of cases. You really had to understand what impact that these cases will have on individuals and make sure, first of all, that they go in wide-eyed. They have an understanding of what they will face and potentially what those impacts could be. In my case, there was very little of that. There was very little preparation in terms of this is what you're going to work. And again, like I said, I had young kids at the time. And, it takes time to really get to a point where you've really decided where you stand on all this. There's some people that can't work these cases. It's never going to work. They'll never be effective because one, they can never be objective and they can never react in a way that doesn't show complete and outright disgust when they're sitting down with that subject who's been accused of sexual assault or whatever. So it takes a period of time, certainly, to work through that. I've told folks, though, that when they work these cases, that you're going to be impacted. You're never going to be the same you were before you work these cases. But it doesn't necessarily have to be bad, right? You just, it's going to be different. You have to understand that. And like I said, there's lots of people that never can get beyond that. And that's good. We should recognize that and move those individuals to someplace else. And there's a tipping point for a lot of people as well, that they can handle this, and at some point they can't anymore.
All right.
So all things that really need to be, certainly for supervisors, people in leadership positions, people that are, charged with ensuring the welfare of the individuals that are working these cases, they really have to be aware of that.
Okay. So let's go through a little bit of progression. So after South Dakota, where do you go to?
So after South Dakota,
Your microphone fell.
So after South Dakota, I went back to Washington, D.C., and I was a supervisor or a program manager at FBI headquarters in the Indian Country Unit. So this is a unit that oversees all of the work that the FBI is doing in tribal communities nationwide. So initially I was a program manager. I was assigned a region of the United States, and I was working specifically with offices that were working matters relating to Indian country matters. In this job, I did a number of things. We had specific funding that I could support cases, I could support equipment purchases. We did a lot of training. We both contracted training, we conducted training. We were there to assist, the offices out there in the field that were working these matters. After about a year, I became the unit chief of that unit. So what that means is I was in charge of the FBI's national program, working with tribal communities. So I had a number of program managers that I worked with that supported tribes and supported different work that was happening in tribal communities. It was an interesting time in that our unit received specific funding from Congress, Tribal Assistance Program funds, that were specifically designated for supporting the FBI and tribal police in Indian country. So we had a fairly large budget. I think we had about $12 million somewhere in there of funding that we could use to support training. So again, we did a lot of training that included not only FBI agents, but BIA agents and tribal agents. We created what we called core skills training that were requirements by FBI, and we encouraged them to be requirements by BIA and tribes. And they were really skills that were everybody needed in Indian country. They were interviewing and interrogation techniques training. They were crime scene management and evidence collection training. It was specific training on homicides, specific training on child sexual abuse, and we had some specialized training as well in other areas.
So Ernie, you're in DC, you're at FBI headquarters as your unit chief.
Yep.
We talked a little bit about before we began this interview, and I'm curious about your perspective of what's going on today with the FBI. So this is kind of a two-parter, which is when you were in the field, specifically working any cases, but a lot of the Indian stuff that you're talking about now, did you ever have an occasion that somebody from FBI headquarters would say, hey, I want you to work the case this way. So that's one question, because the second part of the question is, you hear all this stuff going on right now about cases that are happening across the U.S. involving FBI agents, where FBI agents are complaining, going, look, we run our own cases in the field. We don't get directives from headquarters. So what's your take on that?
When I was working in the field, and there was never a directive from FBI headquarters in terms of how I work my cases. The things that were coming out of FBI and headquarters were maybe the overall priorities. That again, because we have limited manpower working in Indian country, that our priorities are homicides, child sexual abuse, violent crimes, drugs, and so on. It was broad kind of directives, which quite frankly might change a little bit depending on your particular area that you're working and the specific crime problems. And one, on the Rosebud Indian Reservation for a period of time, we had a gang problem. So we began working gang cases, which, weren't in the national hierarchy of things, but were something that impacted the community greatly. But again, in terms of what you're saying, in terms of FBI headquarters directing the way we work cases, never happened.
Yeah, you and I talked about this. Headquarters is there to help support people in the field. I certainly never had anyone from headquarters ever call me on any case that I was working on and say, I need you to do the case this way. And that's the impression. And you tell me, is that the impression you're getting these days? You have these FBI whistleblowers coming forward, and my impression is these guys are just like, how you and I were. They just want to run a case, and all of a sudden they're being told, hey, we want you to do it this way, or you want to do it this way. Am I getting that right, you think?
Yeah. And again, that hasn't been my experience.
Yeah.
I do think bigger, higher profile cases certainly get a lot more attention from FBI headquarters.
Sure.
It's certainly incumbent on the person operationally, doing the case, working the case, and that person's direct, kind of leadership and command to be the ones that, keep things on track.
Right.
If there is, maybe some influence that is coming from headquarters, that doesn't seem to make sense. But in terms of kind of like political influence or anything, I never experienced anything like that.
Okay. All right. So you then become the supervisory senior resident agent in Billings, Montana in, if I'm getting it right, 2004. What are your responsibilities there? What are you doing?
So, well, at that time, I'm back at FBI headquarters. I'm itching to get back out to the field. And really was itching to get back and supporting and working with tribal communities. So my responsibility when I went to Billings, Montana as the SSRA was I was the supervisor for what at that time would have been, I guess, South and Eastern Montana, but oversaw all but one of the Indian country programs in the state. So I oversaw offices that supported investigations on the Crow Indian Reservation, Northern Cheyenne, Fort Peck, the Havre office, which covered Fort Belknap and Rocky Boys. So I actually had 3 offices that were working Indian country matters in Montana. And
so same type of cases you're running in South Dakota?
Yep, same type of cases. Now this time I'm in a supervisory role initially for the first 3 years.
Yeah, so explain that to me a little bit, because I've known FBI agents that do this. How does it work? Because most of the time when you get promoted, you're promoted, then you just
Mhm.
continue up the ranks. FBI is a little odd in respects that, in your case, you're a supervisory special agent in Billings, and then at some point you just go back to being a regular line agent. How does that work?
Yeah. Well, you can do that in
Okay.
the FBI, but oftentimes, again, it's a matter of kind of negotiating your way to there. I wanted to go back to casework. I joined the FBI to do casework as much as it's important to be a supervisor and to be in management and maybe move up and be in executive management. What I really wanted to do was work cases. I wanted to work with victims. I wanted to have the cause and effect of I respond. I work with local law enforcement. I work with victims. I work with others. I put my case together. I present it, and I convict bad guys and get them off the street. So, anyways, when I was in Montana, I was, talking to my management that at the appropriate time, I wanted to go back. I wanted to work in tribal communities. I wanted to do that work. And so after 3 years, I was given, the opportunity to go back, and that's what I did.
Okay.
And went back to work cases on the primarily Crow and Northern Cheyenne, but worked some cold cases on other reservations as well.
Okay. And basically your career progression at that point is you go from Billings to Boise. What takes you from Billings to Boise, Idaho?
So again, in Billings, I'd gone back to casework. I was back working cases, I think 5 years thereabouts. And actually probably a little more. I was doing some casework as the SSRA, and but I had a special agent in charge of the Salt Lake City division that I was friends with. I'd worked with at FBI headquarters. He was one of those individuals that continued to progress. Just about every time an opening would come for a supervisory position in Salt Lake City, he would contact me and ask me if I was interested in this position. And frankly, it just coincided that when the Boise office came open, the timing was right. I mean, in terms of kids, and like I said, I'd been back at casework for 5 years. It was a very busy 5 years. I mean, in terms of the work that was being done, had to be done. So it was a good time for a transition.
Okay.
So ultimately, that's what led me to Boise.
Okay, so you get to Boise in 2012. Are you still working on, even though you're, well, let me ask you this. Are you a RAC, what they consider a RAC, where you're in charge of the office?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're not working cases per se anymore. What is the Boise office working? What kind of cases are they working under
So the Boise office is working all kinds of cases. So because we're a capital city, we've got a public corruption, kind of team that's looking at public corruption. We have a joint terrorism task force. We have an individual who's assigned to the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force that's working child sexual exploitation that's computer facilitated. We've got a Safe Streets Gang Task Force. We had individuals working Indian country crimes. I specifically had the Boise office. I also oversaw initially both Idaho Falls and Pocatello. Ultimately, we closed down and consolidated Idaho Falls and Pocatello. They were working primarily Indian country work on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. We also covered Duck Valley Indian Reservation from Boise, which I kind of take. When we had little things, I would go down and work on those cases, typically grab an available agent if there was one. And if not, I would just go. We had a cyber person, we had foreign counterintelligence, and so on. So Boise is actually a busy and pretty diverse office in terms of the profile of work that's there. And I think I talked a little bit and should tell you a little more about cases, but after just a few days in Boise, I was about 8 days in Boise when I was called from FBI headquarters and was informed that we had what FBI headquarters believed was a major terrorist threat in Boise. Excuse me. I'm going to take a drink.
Yeah, no problem.
But this particular case, I was called. I was working. I was working in Montana. I'd gone back to Montana for a commitment that I had there. And again, contacted by FBI headquarters, informed that there was an individual, Fazlin Kurbanov, who had been communicating with the leader of with the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, their leader in Pakistan, and he was looking for assistance in terms of building bombs and remote detonation of bombs. During their communications, he had indicated that he had targets and he had bombs, and he was ready to act. So, of course, immediately we went into an investigation of Fazlin Kurbanov. Fazlin Kurbanov was living in Boise. He was a truck driver. He was a member of a larger refugee community that was living in a part of Boise. And ultimately, this case grew and grew to be the FBI's number one CONUS-based or U.S.-based terrorism case going. So, and that went for about 10 months, where we were investigating Fazlin Kurbanov, that were using the various tools that are available in order to conduct an investigation of at least a suspected terrorist, in this case, foreign national, using FISAs, using other kind of investigative techniques. We had surveillance on him 24/7 for almost 10 months. At times, we had almost 100 FBI investigations in Boise. But Fazlin Kurbanov was a trucker who would often leave Boise, and we would have FBI teams following him as he traveled from here to the East Coast and to the West Coast, constantly monitoring him. We did a number of things in order to gather information, sensitive techniques, other methods in order to determine his conversations, his communications with overseas folks, with other potential co-conspirators. And ultimately, the case was accelerated after the Boston bombing in April of 2012. After that, there was a push to end our case, ultimately to bring the case down. And at that point, we'd developed enough evidence to have a number of charges against Fazlin Kurbanov. So at the time, it was quite an operation taking place in Boise. And you can imagine we weren't sharing a lot of information outside a very tight circle in Boise. Certainly, there were law enforcement partners that had been brought into the conversation. But I was contacted one day by TSA up at the airport and asking why we had all these planes at the airport. And so anyways, it was quite an operation. Fazlin Kurbanov was ultimately convicted of a number of terrorism-related offenses, was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. In his first stint in federal prison, he ended up assaulting and almost killing a guard and a warden, and ultimately now I think is probably spending the rest of his life in prison.
Fascinating that you had a major, terrorism guy suspect right here in Boise. I mean, you'd never think about it. So Ernie, then ultimately you end up ending your career as the assistant legal attaché in Bangkok, Thailand. Now, in previous interviews, I've interviewed a couple DEA guys that have spent some time overseas, and obviously, it's pretty clear what DEA guys do overseas. Mm-hmm. What's your responsibility as an FBI agent overseas?
So as an FBI agent, ultimately, it's to really develop relationships with our host countries. And, kind of number one is develop those relationships with host countries so that you can work with them in order to really facilitate U.S. investigations that are somehow maybe impacted by entities, other things in that country. For instance, like in Thailand, when I was there, had fairly advanced banking systems. They had banks that could receive lots of money from different places, but they had kind of light or very light internal controls on a lot of their banking operations. So it became a place for maybe money laundering or to set up accounts to facilitate money laundering. A number of things that we did were often working with their basically their financial intelligence unit in Thailand in order to interrupt transfers of money that had been stolen from the U.S. and directed to banks in Thailand, usually by an adversary not from Thailand, but maybe from Russia or from another country that had stolen these monies through maybe through a cyber attack of some type or some other methods. We had a number of cases. We had a case with a Russian national, Dmitry Ukrainsky, who had set up, I think, around 60 shell accounts where he was directing monies that he was essentially stealing through malware that they were putting on U.S. education institutions that amounted to tens of millions of dollars coming into banks in Thailand. We had other very interesting cases over there. I think I talked with you before about it, but one of the interesting cases was the largest, kind of historically, the largest vending site on the dark web called Alpha Bay that was international in nature, that had, I think, at the end of the day, had proceeds running through it, almost $1 billion, was ultimately a case that the administrator was in Thailand, and a lot of the operational components of Alpha Bay were taking place in Thailand.
So did that precede the Silk Road cases?
So that was after the Silk Road cases.
Okay, so that was after the Silk Road cases. Was it the same type of thing, Ernie, where they were just selling all sorts of illegal stuff, drugs? And...
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, same, very similar. The difference was Alpha Bay was exponentially larger than both Silk Road 1 and Silk Road 2. Mm. The head of Alpha Bay was a guy named Alexander Kazas, who was still relatively young. At the time of his arrest, he was 27 years old. He was from Canada. He's someone that would constantly blog under false names about the mistakes that Silk Road made. And ultimately, he made many of those mistakes in terms of, kind of showing off his extensive wealth that he'd gained through his illegal activities. He had a number of sites where he was showing his various cars, Ferraris, and other things. He'd bought multiple properties in Thailand and in other countries. He was putting these things all over Facebook, and ultimately made some mistakes in terms of trying to hide his identity over the years. I will say this is a case that is FBI and DEA were both involved. DEA's interest in the case was this was a prolific site for selling fentanyl. And there were a number of deaths, U.S. deaths, that were a result of distribution, using, or being facilitated through Alpha Bay.
Was the fentanyl originating out of Thailand, or was it coming from China? Did you determine that?
It was coming from all over the place.
Okay.
Yeah, it was coming from all over the place.
Okay. Can you tell me, I asked the DEA guys this, but again, I'm giving you a lot of two-part questions here. What was the Thailand police, Thailand government attitude toward FBI? Did they like having you? Were you a necessary evil? Whatever else. But the same question about the tribal police or working on the reservations.
Yep.
Did they like having you, or were you a necessary evil?
Okay, so I'll go to the Thailand first, and then go to the tribes.
Okay.
But in terms of Thailand, yes, we had a very good relationship. Now, the U.S. in terms of kind of foreign relations with the Thais have been, they're our oldest foreign partner, like literally among any of the nations. I think it's 200 years of alliance and engagement between the Thai government and the U.S. government. The relations are very strong. And the FBI's been there a long time. DEA's been there a long time. We do a number of things, not only in terms of working with them, maybe supporting cases if they need case support. We send lots of Thai law enforcement to training or provide training, and a lot back to the FBI National Academy. So the Thai police, the relationships were always very, very good with the Thai police. And typically we could get things done working directly with the Thai police instead of maybe going through like an MLAT, which is a whole different process that's very complicated. For instance, it's less formal working with the Thai police than it is going through kind of the MLAT process. So again, it was always very good. And ultimately we worked with, when I was there, we worked with the Thai police to develop what they called the TICAC, which was the Thailand Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, which now is a division of the Royal Thai Police. So, we were able to really create something very new for the Thai police and something very needed for the Thai police. Thailand also has, with the help of the Thai police, we developed several Western-style child advocacy centers in Thailand when I was there. The first one in Chiang Mai, the second one in Pattaya, then one in Phuket, and all that kind of facilitated and working with the Thai police, working with NGOs, and working with other kind of local stakeholders. So anyways, now to go to the second part of your question in terms of working with the BIA or the tribe. Typically, the law enforcement relationships were pretty good between the FBI and tribal police, or the FBI and BIA. I can say oftentimes it was more about maybe personality of the individuals, but there could be some history of animosity maybe between the FBI and the tribal police, or the FBI and BIA, that ultimately impacted kind of that most, that being like a more positive engagement. My partners typically, in almost all cases, were either tribal police or BIA police. Very rarely did I have an FBI partner, somebody I worked with directly. So I always found it to be a partnership. And typically, when you found your person you typically worked with, it was a good partnership. And it was something that was positive and worked well. But again, that's not always the case. And I think it's probably very similar to DA going out into work in a county or DA going to work with the state. You're going to have very similar type things. One thing I can tell you, though, it's a little different in the community with the FBI working in tribal communities. In some cases, there might be serious distrust or a lack of interest in engaging with the FBI in tribal communities because, again, that history. But the tribal communities often saw the FBI as a necessary evil in the sense that in order to get justice, they really had to engage with the FBI. If they wanted justice, in the case of a murder or child sexual abuse or whatever, you really had to work with the FBI. You had to engage with the FBI. You had to cooperate with the FBI. So could be a necessary evil or viewed as a necessary evil in that way. In other ways, it might be a very good relationship with the community. I think oftentimes dependent on the individual, but there can be a lot of history out there between federal government and tribes that can impact that engagement.
Two final questions for you, Ernie, that I always ask. Did being in law enforcement affect your family at all?
I'm sure it did. We moved around, a number of times over the years. I wasn't around a lot. I mean, like a lot of folks that are working these types of cases that are reactive in nature, you're gone a lot. You're out on cases, and so you're unavailable because of the amount of time and the frequency of us participating and going to federal court. There were a lot of, let's say, vacations, summer vacations, things like that I was unable to participate in. So oftentimes my wife and children might go somewhere and I wasn't there. But for the most part, I think we were able to manage and manage very, effectively.
Okay.
Over that time.
Going back to when you first started with the FBI, if you can remember back that far, do you remember or do you think there was any change in the way you saw people and the way you interacted with people in society?
Oh yeah, and I think probably this is typical of law enforcement. Maybe you tend to be a lot more discerning and maybe suspicious. Maybe trying to understand somebody's true motives. I think anybody, and it becomes kind of a joke in the areas where I've worked over time, with folks that have worked many years in child sexual abuse or crimes like that we kind of look at every Santa Claus, every coach, every teacher, everybody, suspiciously, right, in terms of their engagements with children. That's not healthy, certainly, but it does impact you. I remember early on when I was working these cases in South Dakota, and I'd come home after a long day of working a case that was child sexual abuse. And my wife and I had plans to go somewhere, and she had a babysitter, and I showed up, and she said, "Oh, our normal babysitter couldn't come. I've got this, this nice young man from, a friend. He's highly recommended." And I said, "Nope, not leaving the nice young boy with my daughters." And again, maybe that was an abnormal reaction, but certainly with the way the work that I was doing, I was uncomfortable with that. I probably would have looked at that a lot different had it not been for the work that I was doing. So certainly it's impacted you. And like I said early on in this, I tell folks that, you're going to be impacted by the work, certainly the work we were doing in tribal communities. For those of us in the FBI that stayed and worked in tribal communities for as long as I did, there's significant impact, but it doesn't have to be bad. It's just, you're going to be different.
Yeah. Ernie, thank you very much for the interview.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.